So next speaker is Tomas Björkman from the Oak Tree Foundation, Oak Tree Island Foundation in Sweden. He's the author of The Nordic Secret. He's a social entrepreneur, and before that, you were a banker, actually.
I'm a reformed investment banker.
Very good. So Thomas will tell us about The Nordic Secret, how to use inner development to build strong democracies. Looking forward to your talk, Thomas.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. So I will speak also, try to limit myself to 20 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity for a few questions. I will be speaking about a book that I recently published together with my Danish co-author Lene Andersen. She is a Danish philosopher and writer, and the book that we've written was out 6 months ago, and it's called The Nordic Secret. So I will now tell you what the Nordic Secret is. But before I do that, I want to give you a cliffhanger. If you look at the cover, so of course you see what is representing the Nordic modernity, the Swedish car industry and the Danish design. You might be a little bit surprised to see Goethe and Schiller up there, the Nordic Secret. Something down there in the corner, but the woman up there on the left, don't give an answer if you know this woman. Who is she? And what is she doing on the cover of our books? So keep that in mind, and I will come back to that at the end. Okay, so yes, you mentioned the Oak Tree Island. That's what we call it in English. In Swedish is EKSKÄRET, EKSKÄRET Foundation. And after I left the banking industry about 10 years ago, I set up the EKSKÄRET Foundation in Stockholm. We own this island. We have a conference facility, retreat center out there, and the foundation is really focusing on the interaction between interpersonal development and societal change. So in the summer, we have a lot of youth camps out there, and the rest of the year we do invitational conferences and we do retreats for adults and personal development, and a lot of interesting stuff. So, before going into the core of the book, I just want to give you a little bit of a framing of the way that I think. So, one thing we constantly read to remind us, I think, is that we are really living in the utopia of our grandparents. On conferences like this, we tend to be very dystopic and saying, wow, the world is falling apart. But we shouldn't forget that these poor guys here could actually have been my grandfather. So this picture is taken exactly 100 years ago in the UK. And my grandfather was actually, both my grandfathers were actually older than those guys 100 years ago. And what they were looking at as a utopia, we have that all today, even in a large part of the world. We shouldn't forget that at least 90% of the people living in the world today live in some sort of utopia of our grandparents. So I just want to say that first, before putting on this picture, which is where we usually start. And that is the picture of all the troubles. And we have heard many speakers today talk about the turbulence of our time. Talk about the turbulence of our time, but also talk about the transition that we are in and the times of transformation. And I believe, just like Ulrike pointed out just before me, that all these different crises, whether it is the environmental crisis, the crisis of hidden algorithms, migration, globalisation, Brexit and Trump, I believe that these are all expressions of one underlying meta-crisis of our time. And this underlying meta-crisis of our time is our collective inability to handle the increasing complexity in our world. our collective inability to handle the increasing complexity of our world. And that could, of course, translate into what you call politics. So individually, we are more or less equipped to handle the complexity. I would say less equipped, but at least we can do a lot individually. But collectively, we are super bad at handling the complexity. So that is really the challenge. And that is, of course, because we have this accelerating growth in technology that is causing a lot of complexity. And we have had an increase in technology ever since, I mean, going back, we start here in the Middle Ages, but if you go back here to more or less the Stone Age, of course we have had a technological development. But that technological development mainly was so slow and took place, at least we could adjust between generations. And that was true even back to my grandparents, I would say. So, like my grandparents, they were farmers, just like their parents were farmers and their parents were farmers. But perhaps their children moved into the city and became factory workers. So you could adjust to the technological development between generations. So we have gone from more or less a constant technological environment to an environment of constant change. And I will not do it now, but sometimes when I give a speech around that, I ask the audience, think for yourself and discuss with your partner or the person beside you. And you won't do that now. But the question is, how many completely different, and then I mean completely different worlds have you lived in? And usually, people come up with something like 2 or 3. If you are younger, even if you are sort of 25, it's probably at least 2 or 3 different worlds. And for me, it's definitely 4 completely different worlds. So we have now to reinvent both ourselves and our organizations more or less completely, perhaps every 10 years. And this is just accelerating. So it will be every 5 years, and then every second year, and then every year. So how shall we be able to handle this? So this is completely new in the time of history. The first time humankind faces this problem. 2 other problems that are also completely new relating to this graph is that we've been living in a world of scarcity, in a scarce resources, in a world of competition. And now, hopefully, we could move into a world of abundance with industrial automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, and all of that. Problem is just that our brain was developed in a world of scarcity, but also our institutions and our societal systems are developed in a world of scarcity. So, for example, for the market to work, you need to have a scarcity of products, and you need to have a scarcity of labor. And then you can have supply and demand to meet. But in a world where you have products in abundance, and as we know, the marginal production cost of most things, not just virtual reality and games, almost most things go towards 0. So in a world where you have an abundance of products and an abundance of labor, not a shortage of labor, then the market will not any longer function as an allocation mechanism. So then we will have a lot of goods, but we have no way to divide it. And that's for the first time that we would be able to move into a world of abundance. And then finally, we've been living in a condition that many environmentalists describe today as an empty planet. We humans did not have a huge impact. So again, in our brain and our mind, we've been living in a world where we in the Stone Age could go out and take as much resources we wanted from the world. We could use them in our cave, and then whatever rubbish we had, we could just throw it outside the cave, and that didn't have a huge impact. Whereas now, for the first time, we living in a full planet. We are already consuming 1.5 planet, and soon we are consuming 3 planets. Our brain was developed in this world, and now we have to live with the same brain in this world. Luckily, we do not only have the brain, we also have the mind, and we have society or culture that can help us. And the solution is not as some in Silicon Valley say, that we need to make an implant in our brain to live here. I don't think we should do that. I think the solution is in our mind and in our culture, in society. I actually think that what we need to do is that we need to reinvent the societal cultural software that we have. And we have done that many times throughout history, and we need to do it now again. And our book is really about these paradigm shifts and how we as humanity have gone through many paradigm shifts, shifting the way we see the world, going from an old paradigm, say the medieval paradigm, that goes up, has a high point at some point, and then you have technological innovations. You have the printing press. You go into a time of turbulence, French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, and then something new is born. And what was born here was, of course, modernity. And the Scandinavian countries manage this transition from the pre-modern society into modernity extremely well. I would say there are no other examples in Europe or elsewhere in the world where this transition was handled so easily and so smoothly, and we will come back to that. And of course, now again, we are in a similar paradigm shift. And now, of course, the old paradigm is modernity, which had its high point in Scandinavia in the 60s, 70s. And now it was not the printing press, but it was things like the internet that sort of started to disrupt this paradigm. And we have all these sort of crises that came out of that. And the question is, how can we transform into some sort of new emerging paradigm? So if that is the broad framing of our book, then the story we tell in our book is something like this. We know from many sources that the position of the Scandinavian countries are quite extreme. And we try to trace the sources to this. And of course, there are many explanations, and we do not claim that our contribution here is any way unique. But we think that we have discovered one aspect that is mainly forgotten in the explanation why the Nordic countries are quite unique today. And to understand that, we need to go back to 150 years ago and realize that 150 years ago, again a little bit before my grandparents, all the Scandinavian countries were actually dirt poor. They were dirt poor, they were agrarian societies, and they were non-democratic societies. If you did not believe in God back then, you were put in prison. Okay. We didn't have any sort of freedom of speech or anything. And that's 150 years ago. Sweden was so poor, and we were starving and having miserable living conditions, so that actually 20% of the working population in Sweden at the second half of the 19th century emigrated to the US. 20% of the working population. And then, just a few decades later, even before the Second World War, we had transitioned into being rich, happy, industrialized, stable democracies. So how did this happen? In times of turbulence and rapid societal change, we all get anxious, we can be afraid, we can be worried. We talked about that this morning. There can be a lot of feelings. And if we are not able to hold all of those feelings, it's very easy for us, and it's a natural tendency, we all tend to do that, and that is to turn to an external authority, something outside of us, something or someone outside us that can help us hold this, that can protect us and that we can put our trust in. It could be a religion, it could be an authoritarian leader. We did it back then, and we are doing it the same today. But 150 years ago in the Nordic countries, we had some extraordinary visionary political leaders and intellectuals. And they did not want to promote religion or authoritarianism. They were deeply committed to building democracy. And they knew that the only way to build stable democracies were to build them from bottom up. And for that purpose, and to enable and empower a large part of the population to be able to be active co-creators of democracy, to be active co-creators, bottom up, of democracy, they, all over the Nordic countries, established retreat centers for inner growth. Yeah, you heard me right. They established retreat centers for inner growth. And this was a massive thing, and nobody knows about this today. It started in Denmark in the 1860s, moved to Norway, and then to Sweden. And then over the next couple of decades, grow rapidly, so that at the turn of the last century, there were actually 100 retreat centers in Denmark, 75 in Norway, and 150 in Sweden. At these retreat centers, young adults, having worked a couple of years, being in their early 20s, mainly from the working or farming part of the population, could spend up to 6 months at these retreats, free of charge, because they were state-funded, but they were not state-run or organized. That's part of the beauty of the concept. They were state-funded, but not state-run. They could spend 6 months at these retreats with the expressed aim of not being politically indoctrinated, but being there to find themselves. Imagine 150 places like this in Sweden where you could stay for 6 months, free of charge, just to sort of find yourself and find your inner compass. Find your inner compass and find yourself, to be able to resist the sirens' calls of authoritarianism or fundamental religion or whatever. And to really be able to get so stable inside that you can handle this complex transition that these politicians knew that their society was just going through. When this program was at its height, almost exactly 100 years ago from now, 10% of each generation of young adults in Scandinavia went through these 6 months retreats. 10%. Imagine what an army of developed, co-creators, enabled, empowered people you have out there. You reach a tipping point. So apart from finding your inner compass, these retreats also gave you the latest technological developments when it came to crafts and farming. It gave you a sense of your place in culture and history, and it also gave you basic tool to organize civic activism and movements. So, where did these ideas, these radical ideas, even for our time radical ideas, come from? Well, they came from here. They came from Germany. They came from Germany. So they came from the German idealist philosophers. And these philosophers, they were read by all the intellectuals in Sweden and in the rest of the Nordic countries back then. And back then, thankfully, most politicians were actually intellectuals. Yeah, believe that or not. And they read Goethe and Schiller, and they read von Humboldt, and they read Herder, and all of these philosophers. And of course, German was the first academic language in Scandinavia back then. And these philosophers, they had all reacted against the Enlightenment's view of our mind as a rational machine. Okay, they said that's not the case. Our mind is not a machine. They say that our mind is an open, self-organizing, they almost used that word, but they said it was a developing organic system under lifelong development. It was a developing system under lifelong development. And our mind is not just in our brain, it's embodied in the totality of our bodies, and it's embedded in culture. So that's what they said. And this is exactly what today developmental psychology, neuroscience, and even behavioral economics tells us. Tells us that these ideas of the rational man or homo economicus, they are deeply flawed. And they knew it, and they wrote about this. So, these ideas of a developing mind, and I don't know how I'm doing for time now. Can I take an example? How much? Okay, so at our youth camps, I was a leader at one of our youth camps a couple of years ago, and I overheard a conversation there between a young girl participant and a leader who was just a few years older than she. She complained about how stressed out she was by all the things she wanted to do. She wanted to hang out with friends, do sports, social media, and all of those things that many young people, and also we are adults, we want to do today, and we are all full of that. And she was so stressed out by this. And this guy who was just a few years older than she asked a few open, probing questions to her. And then all of a sudden she said, now I see I don't have to do all the things I want to do. So something in her had shifted. So then for the first time she was able to actually take her will that somehow previously she had been identifying with and thought that was just herself, and take it out and look at her will and relate to it and say, okay, this is what I want, but then I don't have to do what I want. So she could take the will as an object for her reflection. And then her mind, her awareness, her inner awareness had shifted. She had experienced inner growth. And this is exactly the sort of growth that Goethe and Schiller was talking about, and that we can also later in life experience that as adults, where we can all of a sudden sort of step back from the values and the opinion of our peer groups and form our own opinion and find this sort of inner compass and become inner directed. And it was this inner directed, becoming inner directed, that Goethe and Schiller and the other philosophers were thinking about back then, because they were writing immediately after the French Revolution. And their explanation why the French Revolution had turned out into a bloodbath and war was that not enough people were inner directed. So for any substantial political shift in the future, you needed to have a substantial part of the population having found themselves and to become inner directed. And this is what we picked up in Scandinavia. So why did this not happen here in Germany? Because of this. In 1848, if I remember correct, you had a number of revolutions here in Germany. And Berlin was actually, the government lost control over Berlin for 3 days. It was in the hands of the working population, or in the revolutionaries, or what you would call them. So after that these revolutions had been forcefully put down, nobody in any responsible position here in Germany dared to implement these ideas. So instead, as we've seen, these ideas traveled to Scandinavia and were there implemented on a grand scale. And this is really what we call the Nordic secret, because today, nobody, even in Sweden, knows about this. And the reason why we do not know about this is that after the Second World War, these retreat centers, and we call them folk high schools, lost their focus on personal inner transformation and societal change. They now turned into just adult education centers. And that was because we reverted back to the old view of our mind as a rational decision machine, to the homo economicus picture of our mind. And democracy was more or less taken for granted. So the centers still receive a lot of funding, but are not at all used for this. And that is what we are developing the book as the Nordic secret. And we believe that to transition now again into a new society, we need to do exactly the same thing again. We need to change our view of our mind, go away from the old rational machine thinking, and develop a picture of a growing, constantly growing mind, and tend to that on a large scale. So, before ending, I will go back to the cliffhanger. So, who is she? Sorry, yeah, you were right. I heard somebody. It is Rosa Parks. Who was Rosa Parks? Yes, and she was a central part of the civil rights movement in the US in that respect. Okay, so why do we have her on the cover? Because these ideas of radical human empowerment actually later on traveled in the footsteps of the Nordic immigrants to the US. And 4 retreat centers like this were created in the US. And Rosa Parks has in many interviews said that what gave her the inner strength to know that even if the laws of her society said that she should give up her seat, her inner compass said that she should remain. That was the fact that she had spent 6 months at the Norton Folk High School in Tennessee, where also Martin Luther King sometimes was a teacher. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for your focus also on inner growth, and I think this really complements what we've been discussing the whole day. Thank you so much. We have time for one short question in the tradition of before, and this time it will not be if he wants to be president. Do you? Would you want to be president?
No.
Good. No. Yes. Short question. We have a microphone coming.
Thank you very much for this idea and for this history, for this missing gap also here in Germany, the idea of the retreat center. Fascinating perspective. Can you go a little bit more in details for the next, the mind shift, what you pointed out, what is coming, and the rule of the retreat centers?
Okay, so that's really 2 different questions. In the last part of the book, and I could say that if any of you want to have a copy of the book, if you contact me on LinkedIn or send me an email or give me your business cards, I will make sure that you can get a book, a copy of the Nordic Secret. In the last part of the book, we are speculating about how could this help us today to make the equally or perhaps even greater societal transition that is now facing us. And today, of course, we have different things. I still think that the personal meeting, the authentic meeting with other people and the opening up and the discussion and the dialogue is super important for human growth. But I also think that we could actually use technology. We could use technology to support this. So we need to take the ideas from back then, have a mindset that again recognizes lifelong human growth, recognizing that we are not ready developed. We are not ready developed anytime, that we are on a constant growth, and that growth can be facilitated. And I should just say on the mind shift, I think this is one part of the mind shift that we need to develop a new paradigm. It is realizing inner growth and the importance of that. But other things are things like the fact that we are not those isolated individuals that the Enlightenment philosophers and the economic theory today wants us to believe, that we are much, much more interconnected in many, many ways. That culture, things like the market, we just heard of that this morning and at another presentation, that many things that we take for granted in our culture is actually just social constructs. They are just games that we have created. If that would become sort of general understanding of the general public, that would be very, very good. And then finally, I think that we need to go from a world where we've been so focused on material growth. And again, for my grandparents, that was the main focus. But we live now in a world where more material growth will not make us more happy. And then our focus will shift towards community, to meaning, and to purpose. So I think purpose will be the scarce resource in the next paradigm.
Thank you so much. We have a last and short question by Ulrike. Okay, a short comment.
To bridge the two presentations, yeah? But
please.
Schiller, Goethe, Kant were all about the Republic. Kant already wrote in 792, all political entities should be constituted as a republic, and the sense of republic is basically what you're talking about, which is a community beyond economic efficiency, yeah, right? So there is a linkage between this inner strength and the sort of republican notion as meant by the writings.
Yeah, but and I must comment on that, and you are absolutely right. And the important thing is, of course, that these philosophers, they all started with Kant. Kant was the one that discovered sort of that our mind was not a trivial thing, it was a complicated thing. But interestingly also then, Kant points out that what is enlightenment, his view of enlightenment, and that was that humanity was coming of age. And by that he meant that in order to handle the democracy and the republic, we needed to be inner directed. Because if we were just doing everything else, what everybody else was doing, then we have no evolution. So we need to sort of free our minds from the contemporary pressure of the social norms and find the norms within ourselves, and by that be active co-creators of the world that we create together. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. What's that?
Thank you.
German book for you. Thank you so much. Now everybody is getting a bit tense because the minister is soon arriving. But before that, we'll take the time and share with our two neighbors, people sitting next to us, what has inspired us this day, what we have learned, what is the thing which sticks to you after these 2 days. Please take a moment with your two neighbors and discuss this, and after that I'll collect some voices from you.